1.5 billion years spinning in space. Why struggle to win what you receive by grace? Mr. Wong's trained cormorants, the memories of elephants, Hippocratic oath man, tenuate dustpan. All clear, I am the one that's clouded. Truth is out there, the mystery is shrouded. The blue whale is not for sale. Free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty. It's as old as the bristlecone pines, high above the Nazca lines. The mountain gods of the Machu Picchu, Louis Theroux and the happy bonobo stars. Cars cannot pictures, healing of the mental scars. No one knows the murder of crows. Carl Jung, the gifted one, the masons of the mind, the masons of the mind. Louis Theroux and the happy bonobo, Louis Theroux and the happy bonobo. Free at last, I'm free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty. Memories, dreams and reflections, the road to hell and good intentions. The magic number, number 3, praise the Holy Trinity. Why struggle to win what you receive by grace? 4.5 billion years spinning in space. Martin Luther King said the words that we will sing. Free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty.